Welcome to Crack It. Today we are going to discuss in detail about the annotations in the Spring framework. We already covered few of the annotations in part 1 and part 2 of our Spring Boot annotations series. Please go through it for the better understanding. Also, I have linked the part 2 link here in top right corner of the screen. You can use it. Our channel mainly focuses on the interview questions and we have playlists for Java and Java 8 as well other than Spring. You can go through that if you want. We launched this channel new and we request you to support us through your likes, shares, comments and subscriptions if you like the content. What are stereotype annotations? Let's try to understand that with an example. So I have a class and I want that class to do the role of a controller. How will I inform Spring? That is through the stereotype annotations. So stereotype annotations are a specific type of annotations that are used to mark that specific class which I am going to give that annotation to do a particular role or a purpose in that application. So, if suppose I give a class as a controller, that class will do the particular role of the controller class. This is called the stereotype annotations. These are the specific type of annotations that will be marked on the classes to do a particular role. Stereotype annotations are helpful to simplify the configuration in the Spring framework. How is it simplifying? Suppose say I have a controller class and this controller has different values and behaviors as that of the service class. Service will have different value and behavior and controller will have different value and behavior. So I want to let my Spring framework know that a specific class is a controller class. How will I do it? By providing this stereotype annotation on top of my class. We have 4 different types of stereotype annotations: at component, at controller, at service and at repository. At component we already discussed in part 1 of the Spring annotation series. You can see the link here. If you missed it, you can go and check that. At controller, at service and at repository we are going to discuss in today's video. So we need to always use the Spring stereotype annotations over the concrete classes and not over the interfaces. What does that mean? In real world, we will have, like for a service layer, we will have service interface and the implementation for the service layer, service and service implementation. Similarly, for DAO, we will have DAO and DAO IMPL. So it is always better to use this stereotype annotations over the implementation classes and not over the interfaces. So what is at controller annotation? At controller annotation is a stereotype annotation we just discussed and it is a class level annotation. Yes, all stereotype annotations or class level annotations. So is the at controller annotation. So if I mark my class as with an at controller annotation, it means that I'm going to use that class as a controller. So what is a controller class? A controller class is a class that acts as a web request handler. What does that mean? If a web request comes to the Spring application, what will the Spring application do? The Spring application will accept the request and routes that request to the controller components, and that is called as a web request handler, handling the web request. Also, what will this at controller do with the request? It will process the request and it will provide the appropriate response. So what is the role of the controller? The role of the controller is to accept the request, process the request, to provide the response. Okay. What is this at controller? This is nothing but the specialization of the at component. What will at component do? At component will allow the implementation classes to be auto-detected. Yes, if we provide a class as a at controller, that will also be auto-detected when scanning happens. Why? Because at controller is built on top of at component. At controller is a specialization of the at component. Also, mostly this at controller annotation will be used in combination with the at request mapping annotation. This is the at controller interface. So if we see here, this can be used in alias for at component. Yes, at controller is the specialization of the at component. Also, if we see, this is in the package or Spring framework stereotype, which clearly says that at controller is a stereotype annotation. At request mapping is the annotation that we are going to discuss as the next. So at request mapping annotation is used to map requests to the controller's methods. So When we were discussing about the controllers, I told that if a web request comes in, the Spring framework will route that request to the controllers. So, how in my implementation, I may have many controllers, suppose say 10 controllers, 20 controllers. So, to which specific controller the Spring framework route that request to. So that is based on this at request mapping. So in the at request mapping, I will provide a URL. So based on that URL, my request will get routed to that specific controller. As I told earlier, at controller will be used along with this at request mapping. So it has various attributes to match by URL or by HTTP method, request parameters, headers and media types. So by using all these attributes, my Spring framework will route the request to the specific controller. If I have like 10 controllers, it will route the request to that specific controller. So this at request mapping can be used both at class level and at the method level. So class level, if I have a common URL for that entire controller class, in that situation I will use at request mapping to on top of my controller class. And if I need to do some specializations to that method, then I will go to the method level. And also with this at request mapping, we have like different variants based on the HTTP methods. So if my HTTP method is get, I can use at get mapping instead of at request mapping on my method. If it is a post mapping, post method, then I can use post mapping. Similarly, like put, delete and patch. We can see the implementation examples through code for all these types in our examples or today or in our future videos. At request mapping is mapped using the URL patterns. What are the URL patterns that at request mapping supports is path pattern and ant path matcher pattern. So here are a few examples. I can give like I am a question mark e. What will happen in this case? In this case, it will match one character in the path segment. If I need to match 0 or more characters, then I can give like star.png. I can give star to match multiple path segments. I can also give it inside a braces a variable name. I can capture it as a variable and match it with a path segment. If you are not much clear about this, we will see the implementation for all these through code in our video. You will get a better understanding by that time. This is the implementation. This is the code for the request mapping interface. So we can see that it has value or path, both are aliases, wherein we can give the URL that we need to use. And here if you see, we have one more attribute called method. It is nothing but which HTTP type we are going to use, whether it is a head, call or put, post, delete, head options, which HTTP method we are going to use. That is this one, this request method. And we can pass parameters, we can give headers to the request mapping, we can also give produces and consumes. Consumes is nothing but what type of it is accept, and produces is nothing but what type of response it will produce. We will see all these through an example. This is the coding for it. Before we jump into the coding for all the annotations that we discussed, let's quickly discuss about at response body and at rest controller. So what is this at response body? This at response body, if I used it on a top of a controller, what will happen? So this annotation will automatically serialize the object that needs to be written by the controller into a JSON object. So my controller can return any type of object, say employee or whatever it is. That object will be automatically serialized into JSON, and that is passed back into the HTTP response object. So that is the duty of the at response body. This will automatically serialize my return object, whatever type it is, it will deserialize that type into JSON, and this at response body annotation will pass that into the HTTP response object. So when we use this at response body annotation on a method, Spring converts the return value and writes it to the HTTP response automatically. What is this at rest controller annotation? We already discussed what this at controller annotation is. We now know what at response body annotation is. So at rest controller is nothing but the combination of at controller and at response body annotations. This at-rest controller is a specialized version of the controller. Yes, it is the specialized version because it has an additional property of at-response body to it. So this is a Spring Boot application that I have created using the Spring Initializer. I have added just a class called a Crackit controller, and I've created this controller to demonstrate this at request mapping and at rest controller annotations. So we know rest controller is a combination of the controller and the at response body. If you see here, this at rest controller is itself annotated with at controller and at response body. Also, at request mapping, as we know, this is used to map the request. So if suppose multiple requests are coming to the Spring framework, through this request mapping only, it will redirect the request to which controller it needs to go. Suppose I can have one more controller here, say I Crackit IT1 controller, and that request mapping may be like annotations1/demo. So if a request coming with annotations/demo, the Spring framework will route that request to this controller. How? Using this at request mapping. Why? Because I have provided this at request mapping with annotations/demo value. If suppose the request comes with annotations1 and I have one more controller here, Crackit1, that request will get forwarded to Crackit1 controller. So in this way, this at request mapping is working. So let's see. So I've this at rest controller is a class level annotation. I have added to the class at request mapping, may be used on class level and at the method level. If why I have given like this as a class level, if suppose I can add one more method here, so this path will be common to both these methods, and that is why I have given this at request mapping on top of the class, and this /Crackit, this is a specialization to this method. So I have used this at request mapping here. So let's try to execute this program and see what happens. So if you see, our application started on 8080 port. And what is our path? Our path is /annotations/demo/Crackit. Let's try to execute it and see. See, it have created the get to me. Yes, it is a get method. If you see here, we have given the method type as request method dot get. Yes, it is a get method, and the path is /annotations/demo/Crackit. /annotations/demo/Crackit. I'm trying to execute it. What happens? I'm getting the response as welcome to Crackit, and the response code is 200. So my response, what I am getting? I'm getting this welcome to Crackit, and the response code is 200. We can change this response code as well if we want. I'll cover all those in my next video. This is primarily to focus on the at request mapping and at request controller. So we saw that we have a specialization in the at request mapping as at get mapping. Let's see what happens if I change it to get. So this is no more valid, since that is a parameter for request method. And if I pass it as a Crackit, what will happen? Let's try and see what happens. So if I run it, yes, I'm getting the same welcome to Crackit here. So this at get mapping is nothing but that is a specialization of the at request mapping. So suppose if you see here, we just saw from the port that the port used is 8080. In your interview question, they are asking you how you change the port to say 8081. How do I need to change? So I have a file called application properties. So there we can add server.port equals, now it is 8080, so I'll change it to 8081. Now let's see what happens. If you see here, the port has changed to 8081. I'll go to my controller and I'll try run it. If you see here, the port has been changed from 8080 to 8081. If I try run 8080, it will say that the connection is lost. Why? Because the application is not hosted in 8080 anymore. It is hosted in 8081. So what in all we covered? What is the purpose of at request controller? At request mapping. What is at get mapping? How can you change the port in which your Tomcat is hosted in your Spring application? We have few other annotations like at service, at repository, at value, at path variable. We have like a lot of annotations to cover. So we'll cover all those annotations through creating a RESTful web service like today. We'll continue in our next video. Thanks for watching Crack It. Please support us with your likes, shares, and subscriptions. Stay tuned for updates.